Sacsayhuaman sits on a hill above Cusco, and the first time you stand in front of it, your brain genuinely struggles to process what your eyes are showing you. Stones the size of delivery trucks, some weighing well over 100 tons, fitted together so tightly that you cannot slide a credit card into the seam between them.
No mortar. No cement.
Just rock against rock, locked together for over 500 years, surviving earthquakes that have toppled colonial churches built on flatter, easier ground just down the hill. People love to dress this place up with claims about secret AI analyses uncovering hidden codes, lost frequencies, and forgotten star maps. Most of that is invented for clicks. But here's the thing. You don't need to invent anything. The real story of this wall, the one backed by actual archaeology, geology, and engineering, is strange enough on its own. So let's talk about what we actually know, what we genuinely don't, and why this place still keeps researchers up at night. Sacsayhuaman was built by the Inca, most likely beginning under the Emperor Pachacuti in the 15th century, with construction and expansion continuing under his successors. It sits on a ridge overlooking Cusco, the capital of the Inca Empire, and its most famous feature is a series of 3 massive zigzagging terrace walls built from enormous limestone and diorite blocks. The zigzag isn't decorative. Most researchers believe it was a deliberate defensive design, since a straight wall gives attackers cover and a clean angle of approach, while a zigzag exposes anyone climbing it to fire from multiple directions at once. Spanish chroniclers writing in the 16th century, men who actually watched Inca structures being used, and in some cases dismantled, described Sacsayhuaman as a fortress, and that description has held up reasonably well, even though scholars today think the site likely served ceremonial and symbolic purposes too, not just military ones. The Inca rarely built anything that served only one function. A wall could be a defense, a statement of imperial power, and a piece of sacred geography all at the same time. What makes the place famous, though, isn't the layout. It's the stonework. The blocks in the lower terraces are immense, polygonal, and irregular, yet they interlock with a precision that modern stonemasons still find difficult to fully explain. The largest stone at the site is estimated to weigh somewhere between 120 and 200 tons depending on which survey you trust, and it isn't a smooth rectangular block sitting on flat ground. It's an irregular, multi-sided shape whose surface curves and steps to match the equally irregular stone next to it, on every side, including the top and bottom. That's the part that should genuinely impress you. Cutting one flat face to match another flat face is a solvable problem with enough time and abrasive tools. Cutting an undulating, multi-angled surface so it nests perfectly against another undulating, multi-angled surface on a block too heavy to lift and test fit more than a handful of times is a much harder problem, and the Inca solved it again and again across thousands of stones. So how did they actually do it? This is where the documented archaeology gets interesting because we're not totally in the dark. Quarry sites near Sacsayhuaman show partially cut blocks still in place, abandoned mid-process, which gives researchers a rare window into the technique. The Inca used hammerstones, handheld stones, often harder than the material being worked, like hematite or river cobbles, to pound and shape the quarried blocks through repeated percussion rather than cutting in the way we'd associate with metal chisels. The Inca did have bronze tools, but bronze is too soft to carve limestone or andesite with any real efficiency. The heavy lifting, so to speak, was done by abrasion and controlled fracturing, a slow, almost sculptural process of pounding the stone surface until it conformed to the shape needed. Some experimental archaeologists have actually replicated small-scale versions of this technique and shown that with enough labor and patience, a crew really can shape a boulder this way, joint by joint, fitting each new stone against its neighbors through a laborious cycle of test, mark, remove, repeat. The how did they move it question is less mysterious than people make it sound, even though it's still an extraordinary feat. The Inca had no wheeled vehicles and no large draft animals. Llamas can carry modest loads, but nothing close to multi-ton stones. What they did have was an extremely well-organized labor system called MITA, a form of mandatory rotational labor that the empire used to mobilize huge workforces for state projects, including roads, terraces, and monumental construction. Spanish accounts describe thousands of workers hauling stones using ropes, log rollers, and earthen ramps, with the ramps built up alongside the wall as it rose so that blocks could be dragged into position at height rather than lifted vertically. It's hard work, but it's not unexplainable work. Human beings, organized at scale with strong logistics and an empire's worth of motivation, have moved astonishing weights with ropes and timber across many different cultures and continents. The Inca had something else going for them too, an extraordinarily sophisticated road and logistics network, the Capac Nan, which moved goods, soldiers, and labor across the empire with a level of administrative coordination that often gets underestimated next to the more visually dramatic stonework. Now, the fitting itself, the part where the joints lock so tightly that earthquakes can't shake them apart, that's not folklore, that's measurable engineering. Structural engineers who have studied Inca masonry, particularly at sites like Sacsayhuaman and Machu Picchu, have pointed out that the irregular, interlocking shapes act similarly to a dry stone puzzle. Because the stones aren't simple rectangles stacked in straight courses, the load isn't concentrated along clean fracture lines the way it is in a typical rectangular masonry wall. Energy from seismic shaking gets distributed unevenly across dozens of contact points and irregular surfaces instead of along uniform horizontal joints, which lets the wall flex and resettle slightly during an earthquake rather than shearing apart. Some studies have even modeled this using small-scale shake-table tests with replica polygonal joints, and they generally support the idea that this construction style provides genuine seismic resilience, which is part of why Sacsayhuaman has outlasted the much newer Spanish colonial buildings nearby. That's not a secret hidden by AI. It's published structural analysis, and it's one of the most legitimately impressive things about Inca engineering. Where things get murkier, and where I want to be honest with you instead of inventing a tidy answer, is the question of exactly how precise the fitting tolerances really are and what that precision tells us about Inca measurement and planning methods. You'll often hear claims that you can't fit a knife blade or sheet of paper between the stones, and at many joints that's genuinely true and has been independently verified by visitors and researchers alike. But it's not true everywhere on the site uniformly, and the degree of tightness varies by terrace, by block, and by how much later restoration work has touched a given section. The Inca left no written records in the way we'd recognize them. They used a system of knotted cords called quipu for record keeping, which we still don't fully understand, especially for anything beyond accounting and possibly narrative information. That means we don't have an Inca engineer's notebook explaining their planning process, and that absence of documentation is exactly the gap that pseudo-archaeological claims like to fill with speculation about lost technology or non-human intervention. The honest answer is less exciting than that, but more respectful of the people who actually built this. We are looking at the work of a highly organized state with generations of accumulated stoneworking knowledge, refined trial and error, an enormous and disciplined labor force, and a cultural investment in monumental architecture as a display of imperial and spiritual authority. That's not a lesser explanation. If anything, it's a heavier one because it means ordinary people, generation after generation, achieve this with hammerstones and ropes and stubborn persistence. It's also worth correcting something people get wrong constantly, which is the idea that Sacsayhuaman is somehow unexplained by archaeologists, as if the field has thrown up its hands. It hasn't. We have a fairly well-supported chronology, established through a mix of Spanish colonial documentation, radiocarbon dating of organic material found at associated sites, and stylistic comparison with other confirmed Inca constructions. We know roughly when major construction phases happened. We have eyewitness Spanish accounts from the conquest period describing the site in active use, and we know what happened to it afterward, which is itself a difficult story. After the Spanish took Cusco, they dismantled large portions of Sacsayhuaman's upper structures and smaller stones to build colonial buildings in the city below, including parts of the cathedral. The site we see today, especially the towering lower terraces, survived largely because those particular stones were simply too massive for the Spanish to practically move. So part of what makes Sacsayhuaman look so otherworldly today is almost an accident of looting. The easier stones were stolen and reused, and the hardest, heaviest, most impressive stones were the ones left behind because nobody could budge them. I think that detail matters because it reframes the mystery. The wall isn't a complete, untouched message frozen in time waiting for a machine to decode it. It's the surviving fragment of something larger that was partially dismantled by colonizers, studied unevenly across 3 centuries by people working with different tools, different priorities, and very different levels of respect for the descendants of the people who actually built it. The real scientific frontier here isn't some hidden code in the joints. It's basic, unglamorous, ongoing work, better 3D laser scanning to map every block precisely, isotope and trace element analysis of the quarried stone to pin down exactly where each block came from, comparative studies of construction technique across other Inca sites to understand how the craft evolved, and continued collaboration with Quechua-speaking communities and Peruvian archaeologists whose ancestors actually carried this knowledge, rather than treating the site as a blank mystery for outsiders to solve from scratch. There is recent work using laser scanning and photogrammetry at Inca sites, and it has been genuinely useful, just not in the sensationalized way some online content frames it. Researchers have used LiDAR and high-resolution 3D scans to document joint geometry at a level of detail that was simply impossible with tape measures and sketches, and that data has helped clarify construction sequencing, helped identify likely tool marks, and helped engineers build more accurate seismic models of how these walls behave during earthquakes. That is useful, careful, slow science. It does not involve an AI discovering secret lunar alignments or hidden acoustic frequencies tuned to make people feel a divine presence. Those are the kinds of claims that sound thrilling in a video but don't hold up to scrutiny, and frankly, they tend to drown out the actual achievement, which is that a civilization without iron tools, without the wheel for transport, and without a written language in the conventional sense, built some of the most seismically resilient stonework on the planet using organization, observation, and an enormous collective effort sustained across generations. So, what should genuinely impress you about Sacsayhuaman? Without exaggeration, start with the scale of labor coordination. Spanish chronicler accounts, cross-referenced with later archaeological estimates, suggest the site's major construction phases involved tens of thousands of workers across different periods, rotating through the MITA labor system, fed and housed by an imperial logistics network sophisticated enough to keep that workforce supplied at altitude, far from easy agricultural land. Then there's the stone selection itself. The builders didn't use whatever rock happened to be closest. Different sections of the wall used different stone types, some andesite quarried from sites a few kilometers away, some limestone sourced more locally, and the choice of which stone went where appears tied to both structural needs and the practicalities of what could realistically be moved that distance. Then there's the actual fitting technique, which involved a process of repeatedly testing a new block against its neighbors, marking high points, removing the block, grinding down the marked areas, and trying again, sometimes dozens of times per stone, for stones that might weigh as much as a loaded shipping container. That is not a flashy story about lost technology. That is a story about extraordinary patience, skill passed down through specialized stonemason lineages, and a state willing to invest staggering resources into a single architectural statement. And maybe that's the actual point worth sitting with. We keep reaching for explanations involving secret knowledge, lost civilizations, or machines uncovering what humans somehow missed, because it feels more satisfying than the truth, which is that human beings using stone tools, rope, and an almost unimaginable amount of organized labor did this themselves. No outside intervention required. No forgotten ancient technology. Just generations of Andean stonemasons who understood their material, refined their craft, and built something that has now outlasted the empire that made it by 5 centuries and counting. Modern engineers studying the site aren't decoding a hidden message. They're trying to understand, joint by joint, just how good these builders actually were, and the more carefully people look, using real tools like laser scanning, materials science, and structural modeling rather than speculation, the more it becomes clear that the achievement doesn't need embellishing. It was already remarkable. If you want the honest mystery, here it is, and it's a good one. We still don't fully understand the precise logistics of how individual 100-ton blocks were maneuvered into final position at height, how Inca engineers planned joint geometry in advance without anything resembling modern drafting tools, or exactly how stoneworking knowledge was transmitted and standardized across a workforce that rotated constantly under the MITA system. Those are real open questions that real archaeologists are still chipping away at, sometimes literally. That uncertainty isn't a gap to be filled with invented AI revelations or vague talk of lost ancient wisdom. It's an invitation to keep doing the slow, careful work, scanning more joints, studying more quarries, listening to the communities whose ancestors built this place, and letting the evidence speak for itself, even when it speaks slowly. Sacsayhuaman doesn't need a secret to be extraordinary. It already is one, sitting in plain sight above Cusco, exactly as it has for over 500 years.